Good morning, everyone. This is George Spees from the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar where we have Tyler Stump from the Pennsylvania State Archives, who's going to talk to us about records management and electronic records best practices. This is always a popular topic and one where we get a lot of questions here at the Office of Open Records that, you know, it's really not our area of expertise. So we always are happy to have Tyler here to kind of educate all of us on this topic. So if you have any questions, Tyler will open it up and you can type them in the conversation pane. Also, if you have any questions about other topics that are not related to records management, I would ask that you hold back on those, but then feel free to contact the office. Go to our website where we have some email accounts. You can contact us that way, or you can call the office directly and they'll put you in touch with me. If also after the session you have questions on records management, Tyler's contact information is up on the screen right now. Feel free to reach out to him, or again, you can reach out to our office, and if it's something we can't help you with, we'll put you in touch with Tyler or one of his colleagues. So all that being said, I want to turn the microphone over to Tyler, and we're looking forward to a good session. Good morning, Tyler.
All right, thanks, George. Let me just get settled in here, and then we'll jump right into it. Hope everyone is having a good day so far. It's very muggy and humid here in Harrisburg, which we were hoping for fall to actually start, but it looks like it's going to take a little bit longer to get going. All right, so let's just jump right into it. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for listening in today. My name is Tyler Stump, and I am an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives here in Harrisburg, which is a bureau of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Today I'm going to talk, like George said, about some of the basics of records management and electronic records best practices that the Commonwealth has. And just thanks again to George for inviting me to speak here today. There's a lot of really important overlap between records management rules and policies that my office has, and then that the Office of Open Records works with, so I'm glad that I have this opportunity to speak with you all today. Alrighty, records management. Records. Records can be really overwhelming if we don't keep on top of them, but with the help of the Commonwealth's records retention manuals and a few other tools and tips and pieces of advice, managing your records can be cost-effective, efficient, and decrease your office's liabilities so that you can focus on the important work that you are there to do in your office. And by the end of this webinar, you should have a good sense of what rules are out there and how to make sure that you and your staff are following them. And you'll also learn about some important things about creating and storing electronic records, including the Commonwealth's, well, I guess it's not new anymore, but it's relatively new permanent electronic records policy that was issued just a few years ago. Okay, so before we dive in, I just want to add one big caveat to this presentation. Pennsylvania has different rules and different laws that apply to state, county, and local governments and for school districts when it comes to records management and records retention. Although these are similar, these laws and policies that govern records management for each level of government are different in a couple of ways. So I understand that most folks listening today are from municipalities, so I'm going to focus this presentation on local government records rules. But the principles behind everything I'm saying are going to apply equally to other levels of government, just the same. So if you work in a state or county government or at a school district, please keep listening in, and this all will apply to you. But just there's a couple of differences every now and then. So feel free to check in with me at the State Archives, or take a look at some of the actual manuals and other resources that are out there, just to make sure that you're on the same page with what your actual responsibilities are when it comes to records and what the policies are for you. But no matter what level of government you work in, the goal of records management is always the same. So let's just take a moment and think about how your office manages its records. What do you think good records management means for you? And do you think your office is managing its records well right now? Well, I'm going to bring this up. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania defines records management as, quote, planning, controlling, directing, organizing, training, promoting, and other managerial activities involved with respect to records creation, records maintenance and use, and records disposition in order to achieve adequate and proper documentation of the policies and transactions of the Commonwealth for an effective and economical management of agency operations. That's a pretty good definition, but it's pretty wordy. It's quite a mouthful. I like to say that in government, at least in Pennsylvania, records management boils down to 3 key things. 1, ensuring that information is available from the time of its creation to the time of its disposal, or when we get rid of it, to allow government to function. 2, we want to protect the interests of government, and our constituents. And 3, we want to do all of this at the lowest possible cost. And that's really, we want to be efficient and effective with how we're handling and using our records as much as we can. But what does that actually mean for us as records management, kind of on the practical side of things? It means that we need to ensure that information is available when it's needed for our agency or our office's functions and business. And notice that I use the word information here instead of documents or records. Especially now when we have so many electronic records and so many different formats and types of records, we really need to focus on just the informational or the data content of our records, and that's what records management is really getting at. Records management means that if we manage our records efficiently, then we should expect to see a significant reduction in our business costs, whether that comes from storage costs, staff time to locate, retrieve, and access records, avoided lawsuits and other liabilities, or anything else that comes with that. And the other thing that records management really means for us on a practical level is that we want to keep our records for as long as we need them, or as long as we're required to have them, but then we want to get rid of them and dispose of them as quickly as possible. I'm going to repeat that again. We want to keep our records as long as we are required to, and then we want to dispose of them quickly. Especially when we're thinking about the Open Records Act, right to know requests. This is really important, so I'm going to touch on this point several more times in this presentation or this webinar today. But just keep in mind, keeping records that are not in active use and are past their designated retention times is going to increase your storage costs substantially and make it harder for you to respond to right to know and other records requests in the future. I'm going to repeat this point a couple of times because it's just really important, and that's really where I see a lot of offices run into problems with records management, when they're over-saving things, when they're keeping records that they don't need to have anymore. And so, on that note, I will show you one of my favorite pictures. Maybe it's a kind of a scary picture from records management. Does anyone have a storeroom somewhere in your building or somewhere in the office that looks something like this? I sure hope you do not. This is a great example of what poor records management looks like. There is a literal ton of material here in this room, but how would you or your staff find any particular record if you were storing your records like this? How would you know what you have, and if you could get rid of anything at a certain point in time? Just think about the risks that come from storing records like this. And here's another photo of a different angle of that giant pile of records. At this office that we have here in the photo, they had 2 big issues. They were over-saving records, and they weren't keeping good track of what was stored there. Things were kind of haphazardly labeled. Some things were not labeled at all. Things were not grouped or organized together by the type of record or their retention time or anything like that. They really had no idea what was here in this mound of records. And just think about the problems this causes. Over-saving records increases your storage cost, and when you run out of room, you're not left with a lot of options. The reason that we got called in to help with this particular issue was that their storage spaces were full, and they were looking at spending a lot of money to rent another storage facility just to put more records in, when it turned out that they didn't really need that space after all, because they didn't have to keep a lot of these records. It takes longer to locate and retrieve records when you need them. And like I said before, this is a big issue, especially when we get to right-to-know requests or litigation or other kind of official needs for records on a kind of limited amount of time. And we'll talk about this more, but if you have a record that's past retention and you could have purged or gotten rid of it, you are not required to produce, or sorry, let me start that over because that's important. If you have records in your possession that you could have gotten rid of because they are past retention but you didn't, they are still subject to right-to-know requests and litigation, even though you could have in theory gotten rid of them and not been responsible for them. And kind of moving on a little bit to another thought, what happens when there's emergency or some kind of really extreme need to have records as fast as possible? What if there is, a leaky pipe, or what if there is another pandemic and all of our staff are being sent home and need to access some records that they need to work on at home instead of in the office? When disasters or emergency situations strike, we only want to have to worry about the records that we need, and oversaving or not labeling our records makes it hard to determine what we need and what we need to focus on with our records. So like I've said a couple times already, and I'm just going to try and drill this right into your brain, we want to keep our records for as long as necessary, and then we want to get rid of them. We want to avoid all of those costs and liabilities. We don't want, one staff person who's hoarding records and keeping things for too long. That's really, or maybe several staff, or maybe it's us ourselves. I'm guilty of that from time to time. But that's something that we just need to keep on thinking about, and we need to be very conscious and aware of how long we have to keep our records and when we can dispose of them. So here is another photo of that same office that I showed before, and this is what they were able to whittle down their big pile of records to once they applied records retention schedules to that mass of records. They realized that they had a lot of material that they did not need to keep anymore, and they shouldn't have anymore. So they were able to get rid of a lot of things and ended up with a much more manageable collection of records, as you can see here. And they were also able to label everything so they knew what they had and where it actually was, and they didn't have to just kind of rifle through boxes as they were looking for something. Alright, so before we get any further into records management and the record manual that I mentioned a moment ago, let's make sure that we're on the same page when we're talking about what a record actually is, because I think sometimes we have some misconceptions about that. So think about that for one quick second. How would you define a record, at least in the official sense in terms of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and our government and our business? What is a record? The Municipal Records Act of 1968 defines a record as, quote, any papers, dockets, books, maps, photographs, or other documentary materials, regardless of physical form or characteristic, made or received by an entity under law or in connection with the exercise of its powers and the discharge of its duties. And the definitions for county and state offices are practically identical to this in their own respective legislation. And the Open Record Act uses a very similar definition for a record too, which I have here on the bottom of the screen. So when we talk about records, we're talking about information. It doesn't really matter if it's paper or it's electronic or microfilm or a photograph or anything else. As long as something is evidence of your government's business and activities, if it's information that documents that, it should be considered a record. And we should keep in mind that this definition of records also extends to documents that are created by vendors or contractors, if it's related to business that we're doing with them or that they are doing on our behalf as well. So even though the records might not live in our office, they may be stored on a vendor's computer or in a contractor in their office or their storage facility, they're still considered government or public records. So we said that any record that is, or the information that's generated or maintained by our office is a record. And these are all subject to the requirements of state records laws and subject to the right-to-know law. However, there are some materials, published material used for reference, duplicate copies of documents, transitory notes, blank forms, things that don't contain original or official information from your office. In these cases, the Municipal Records Act considers them, they call them non-records or reference materials. And it says that your office is required to keep them for, quote, as long as you have an administrative need or value for them, and then you can dispose of them. So there's no specific amount of time that you need to keep those records. But, and this is important, the right-to-know law still applies to all of these records or non-records as long as they're still in your possession. So let's say, for example, your office has a manual written by a federal agency that you use for reference purposes. Maybe it's from the Department of Education or the Environmental Protection Agency. Or you have a copy of a published law of Pennsylvania. This is not a record that you created. It's a copy of a document that another level of government and another office made. Technically, that's still subject to right to know as long as it's in your possession, but you only need to keep that manual or that copy of the legislation for as long as you and your staff are actually using it for business reasons, and then you can get rid of it at any time. So it's not considered an official record, and it has no scheduled retention time for it. Okay, so now that we know what documents in our office are officially records and which ones are non-records, I think it's useful just to think about where we're storing our records. Hopefully we all have some kind of filing and organizing procedure for our records, but it's always useful to review that and make sure that how we're storing records is actually effective and useful for our staff every once in a while. Are the records that you have in your office stored in places where your staff can get to them quickly and efficiently? Do you keep records in busy work areas that are infrequently used and could be moved somewhere else maybe that's a little more practical for them? It's important to try and balance the ease of access to your records with the efficiency and cost of storage for them at the same time. So think about, short-term records or records that maybe you don't need to keep them as long, but you're using them a lot for, a particular project or something that's going on kind of in the short-term immediate time. You want to keep those records near staff work areas, maybe in a filing cabinet in the office, that kind of thing. If you have records that have longer-term retention, they're important to keep, especially for legal and administrative reasons, but you're not looking at them every single day. Maybe you want to keep them in a storeroom in the office or on shelving somewhere a little bit further away from your desk or something like that. And then there are permanent records, which are the ones that we don't look at them hardly often, but they have really extreme, legal or fiscal value to us. That could be, deeds to property. That could be old copies of ordinances, which are still on the books, but we don't really reference them every single day. Things like that. Those are the ones that we might want to keep in off-site storage. If they're electronic, we might want to have them stored kind of in a secure cloud storage that might not be on just a particular employee's computer or something like that. Again, there's no formal requirements for where any particular records must be kept, but this is just something to keep in mind and just to think about when we're talking about how to effectively store our records in our office and in all of our storage spaces. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what a record is, how to kind of store it effectively, but how do we know how long we actually have to keep those records? So I've talked a little bit about retention times, and we want to keep our records for as long as we're required to, and then we want to get rid of them or dispose of them afterwards. But how do you and how do your staff know how long you actually have to keep those records, what the requirements are? Fortunately, there are records retention schedules that help take all of the guesswork out of this, so you don't have to decide on your own. The Commonwealth issues records retention manuals for municipal, county, and state offices. Like I said before, I'm going to focus today on the municipal one, but keep in mind that the county and state ones are very similar but not quite identical to this. The Municipal Records Manual is written by the Governor's Local Government Records Committee and staff from the State Archives, which is my office. And it's been around since the Municipal Records Act was passed in 1968, and that's where its authority comes from. And it was last updated in 2019, so just 2 years ago. The manual is available on the State Archives website, and I have a link to that up on the screen. If you visit our website or if you just Google Pennsylvania State Archives, we have a records management page, and it's right up there. It's pretty easy to find. And I'd recommend that you make sure that you have the most recent version if you already have a copy, especially if you have an older paper copy. Like I said, the new one is just 2 years old, and we did make some changes in the last update. The manual has information on how long to keep records and what to do with them once you no longer have to keep them, once they're past that retention time. The manual authorizes you to keep official records in electronic format, which is also another change that we had fairly recently, where in the past that wasn't always the case. And as long as you are following the procedures laid out in this manual, you and your staff cannot be held liable for records that you've disposed of appropriately. And I'll talk about more about that in a moment. Give me 1 sec while I get a drink here real quick. Okay. This is a copy of the front cover of the Municipal Records Manual, just to make sure everybody knows what it looks like and what we're talking about. If you already have a copy, like I said, just double check to make sure that the date at the bottom of this cover page says last amended March 2019, just to make sure you've got the current one. Okay, and I see I see here a question about right to know records. Let me get to that in a couple of slides. I'm glad you asked that, Kimberly. I just want to let you know I saw your question. Okay, so let me go forward here. So most pages in the manual look like this. It's a long list of different types of records and instructions on how to manage them. Types of records are organized by the usual office of origin, like police department or water authority or HR office, things like that. And each record has 4 different, pieces of information. It has an identifying record number or a citation, an official title, a description of the record, because sometimes our offices will have different names for the same record, so the description will really let you know that you're looking at the right thing. And it will have a retention time, which is either a specific length of time, like 5 years, or until this employee departs or something like that, or it will say permanent. So there's kind of 2 options. You either have permanent or you have non-permanent, which is a finite number of years. And I'm actually going to answer Kimberly's question real quick and bring out my own copy of the manual to see how long right-to-know records need to be kept. So bear with me for one moment while I just flip through it. Okay. George is telling me it's 2 years, but I'm going to look it up real quick just so I can read the actual citation. All right, give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay, so if you're looking at the Municipal Records Manual, it's in the Administrative and Legal Records section, which is citation AL-46, Right to Know Requests. And it says here that, like George said, the retention period is 2 years for those records. So that's straight from the manual. Good job, George. You get a sticker today for knowing that off the top of your head.
Just a caveat, if it's still active within the court system until all appeals have been exhausted.
Okay, great. And just in case you couldn't hear that, George is kind of on the other side of the room. He says the retention is 2 years unless the right to know records are still, under litigation or kind of it's an active case. And in that case, you would need to wait until all the appeals are finished with. Did I get that right? Okay. Okay, thank you for asking that. Okay, let's keep moving on. I'm going to have another break for questions in a little bit, so if you've got any questions on your mind, feel free to save them for then, or just type them in right now, and I will get to them once we've got a break, and then we'll have a time at the end also to answer more questions. But I just want to get through some of the slides to make sure we're kind of all on the same page and we cover the basics first. Okay, so like I said, this manual is pretty straightforward with the explanation of retention times and all the records that it lists. This should list really 99% of all the records that your office creates and maintains. And if you can't find what you're looking for, you can always give us a call here at the State Archives. You're probably not the first person to ask us a question if you've got some kind of either unique or some specific record that you're not finding listed explicitly. We've probably seen it before, even though it might not be listed in the schedule or it just might be hard to find, so we'd be more than happy to help you out with that. All right. The manual doesn't have a lot of specifics about how records need to be maintained during their retention time. So as long as you are keeping records secure and accessible to the appropriate staff or members of the public, it's okay as per the records schedule or the records manual. There are some rules for permanent records that are being kept in electronic form, though, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. But in general, especially for paper records, it's not like records must be kept in a certain area or a certain place or labeled in a certain way. That's up to whatever is most efficient or most useful for you and your staff. If a record has non-permanent retention, so it has a finite number of years that it must be kept, then those records can be destroyed when they've met the end of their retention period. The only exception to this is if records are part of ongoing litigation or anything of that kind of nature. The manual states that you and your office, or rather your municipality, should pass a resolution each time you're destroying records, listing the name, date range, and quantity of records that are being destroyed. And there is an example resolution at the end of this manual in Appendix C that you can look at just to see what that resolution typically looks like when municipalities pass one. The manual also has specific instructions for the disposal of records that have permanent retention. And remember, this only applies if the manual explicitly says a record has permanent retention. This happens a lot of times when an office has permanent paper records and they don't have room for them or they want to get rid of them. So typically they will either microfilm the records or they'll scan them and digitize them. There is one procedure and one kind of additional form that you'll have to submit if you're microfilming records, and there's another separate one if you're going to scan or digitize those records, which I will talk more about that in a couple of slides. But either way, what I just want to say here in this webinar is if a record has permanent retention and you want to get rid of your paper copies of it, there isn't at least one additional step that you're going to have to follow, and that's all spelled out in the manual. I just want to make sure we're all kind of aware of that, and we know that we should be looking into the manual for all the specifics. As I mentioned before, and I like to repeat this a couple of times, as long as you and your staff are following the instructions that are spelled out in the manual, you cannot be held liable to produce records that you've disposed of appropriately. So if something is past its retention time, if it says keep it for 5 years and you got rid of it for 5 years, and then 8 years from now you get a right to know request, you would not be held liable for not being able to produce those records because they passed their retention time. Okay, I mentioned this in the last slide, but I'm just going to cover it again. Your municipality's governing body needs to pass a resolution each time you're disposing of records after their retention. This is done each time you're getting rid of records, but you can use one resolution to cover many different records if you're getting rid of them all at once. And I know a lot of offices, it's the end of the year, and their staff are going through the office and just looking for all records that, after this year, they're beyond their retention time. So let's say you work in, the fire department for your borough, and at the end of the year you might find you have daily activity records and drill reports and some permits that are now all past their retention time. They expired at the end of 2021. You can list all of them together on one resolution instead of doing separate resolutions to destroy each of those types of records. You just need to list the record titles, date ranges, and volume, so how many boxes or how many linear feet of records is being destroyed. And actually, yeah, good. So I have on this next slide, this is just a copy of the page in the manual that has the sample disposal resolution, and it's really simple. You can just kind of plug in the name of your municipality and the types of records that you're getting rid of right here in this form, and then have your governing body sign off on it, and then you should be good to go. The Municipal Records Act and the Right to Know law are both very clear that if you're following retention times and you're getting rid of records at the end of those retention times, you cannot be held responsible for records disposed of appropriately. So as long as you're disposing of records in accordance with the manual, the Municipal Records Act will protect your office from any liability if that comes up. Likewise, the Right to Know law states that the law does not trump the records retention policies that are in this manual. So that means your office should be following the retention stated in the manual first, and right to know concerns should come second. And like George mentioned earlier, if you have records that are part of active litigation or an active right to know request and they meet the end of their retention, you need to hold on to them until that's finished. We always want to keep on holding on to records while they're in active use. But once they're past their retention period and they're also inactive, they're no longer in use, that's when you want to start thinking about it's time to destroy or dispose of these records. We want to get rid of them then. Okay, this is a good time to stop real quick and I'm going to look in the chat to see if we have any questions. If anything else is on your mind right now, please feel free to type it in there, and I'd be more than happy to answer. Okay, let's see. I have one comment here from Jackie who writes, my understanding was that personal notes or drafts are not subject to right to know. Are you saying that if personal notes are in our possession, they are covered by right to know and we would have to give them to a requester? And I'm going to let George answer that just because he's a little more knowledgeable than me.
Yeah, Jackie, I think you're right, where as far as personal notes, if they're just for your own edification and future reference, that there is an exemption within the right to know law that would cover those and they would not be subject to public release. Where we're talking about drafts, I think we need to be careful there because the infamous B10 exemption comes into play, where sometimes agencies will withhold drafts because they claim that they are pre-decisional in nature. And it's probably the toughest exemption when it comes to legal interpretation. Where we're at now is that if a draft contains factual information, there's a good possibility that it may be subject to right to know. But if there are elements of that what we would call discretionary, where maybe the draft is presenting options available to a board to make a decision one way or the other, that would be considered pre-decisional, and it could be withheld. So, I'm reluctant to give you a definitive answer on that term draft because of the many legal ramifications that could be involved. But I think you are right when it comes to consideration of personal notes. Good question.
Thanks, George. And thanks, Jackie, for that question. And I'll just add to that from the records management and retention perspective. If you remember, I had a slide earlier where I said it's the information that counts for retention and not just a document or a piece of paper. And so when an office has a draft of a record or notes, but then there's like a final official copy of something later on, that typically means that the information is duplicated between, the original draft or all the different copies of drafts and the final document. So as far as records retention is concerned, the final version is like the official record, and then the earlier drafts, as long as there's nothing in them that's unique information that's not somewhere else, that would just be duplicate copies of that information, so those drafts can be disposed of at any time because they're not necessarily considered records. Of course, it's kind of like George, it depends, and it depends on what your business need for those drafts are as well. But what we're trying to avoid on the records management side, especially now with electronic records, is we don't want you to have a file folder that has 19 different drafts of some document, and that's just taking up a lot of space that we don't need to have. So that's something that we're trying to avoid, and so you can get rid of those draft copies typically at any time, and then the final copy would be subject to the retention period. So, okay, I don't see any other questions in here. If there's anything on your mind, please feel free to drop it in the chat thing so I can read it at some point, but we'll have time at the end of this also to cover any other questions on your mind that might come up. All right, so let's keep moving to electronic records. So let's talk about electronic records a little bit. Everybody has electronic records. If you don't make any electronic records in your office, then you should probably have a prize. You're probably the only one in Pennsylvania. I would like to see how you do business. I'd be fascinated. And we are making more electronic records all the time. I don't know what the numbers are, but the amount of electronic records that Pennsylvania government offices have increases exponentially every single year. It's just massive amounts of data and records and documents and files. But it's important to remember because electronic records, they look a lot different. We use them differently, everything like that. It seems a lot different. But we need to remember we're applying records management practices to our electronic records just the same as we would with paper. Nothing has really changed here. Because remember, like I said just a moment ago with Jackie's question, it's the information that counts as far as records management goes. So it doesn't matter if it is an email or if it's a piece of paper or if it's a copy of that you scanned onto your computer. Records management is going to apply basically the same way to our electronic records because it's the information that we have to worry about and deal with. So, like I said, information and regardless of form are kind of the language that records management legislation in Pennsylvania phrases these sorts of things. So it says that the retention and disposal of a paper document should be thought of and done in the exact same way that we would with a scanned copy of a document or an email or anything else, because it's the information that we're really worried about, or should be concerned about, rather. But with electronic records, it's doubly important to make sure that records are retrievable and accessible for their retention time. If you cannot provide access to an electronic record, it is considered destroyed by the records by the Municipal Records Act. So that means if you have old records that are stored on a floppy disk that's on a shelf, or maybe on a flash drive, maybe they are stored in an old file format, or if they are in a document that's been corrupted on somebody's computer, if you can't read those filed. You can't bring them up and actually get to that information. It's legally considered destroyed. So that's something we need to watch out for. We need to make sure that our records are being, I guess, managed or stored and monitored in a way so that records are always available when we need to get them while they're under retention. And finally, I'll just address this really quickly because I get a lot of questions about this, or our office does. But people ask, okay, we have lots of email. How long do we keep it? And the answer to that question is always, it depends. Remember, like we said, it's the information that counts, not the format. You might have an email that is just, a personal, hey, let's get together for lunch kind of a thing. And that's just a personal thing that doesn't need to be kept for any retention. You can get rid of that immediately. If you have an email that contains, a draft of something that you're working on, or maybe it covers, important official correspondence with a constituent or something like that, that's going to be something that's subject to a different retention period, just like it would be if it was a paper document. So I think you need to just go back to the retention manual and look up, for each email or for each kind of email that you and your office has, how long do we keep this, how long do we keep that, and apply it to email just as you would for any other kind of record format. Okay, I'm not going to go through everything I have here on the screen, but I just want to point out that there are a lot of risks to electronic records. I know that electronic records are great and they make our lives a lot easier in a lot of different ways, and I'm all for electronic records, but at the same time, electronic records technology advances really fast, so a lot of these formats are kind of unreliable when it comes to records retention. Microsoft Word and programs like that are not built with the intention just of how long can we keep these records. They're built for the present day. We are creating records and, editing them. They're not concerned with, how do we keep this record secure for 50 years, because that's its retention. Floppy disks were pretty common just maybe a decade ago or so. And I don't think I've seen a computer in an office that has a floppy disk drive for a long time. I mean, we have one in our office in the archives that we keep just for, historical records and things like that, or really old stuff, but that's one of the few ones that I've ever seen. And 10 years is not a long time when we're talking about records retention. When we're talking about records that are required to be kept for 10 years, for 20 years, for the lifetime of an employee, when we talk about pension records, and when we talk about records with permanent retentions, we have to keep them forever. We have to be really careful with our electronic records, or records that are stored electronically, just because there are so many risks that can happen over the years. Another archivist I know always says that paper records are kind of like a teenager, where you kind of get them kind of settled and ready to go, and then you don't really have to keep an eye on them. They're kind of good on their own. They can sit in storage on a shelf or something like that. But electronic records are kind of like a toddler, where you have to kind of continually watch them, make sure that they're okay, make sure that nothing is happening, just because whether it's, a file could get corrupted, or you could have a computer could crash and you could lose something. So one of your employees could click on a fishy email and you could get a virus in that impacts things. People could delete things by accident. Just so many things can happen. And if we lose electronic records, especially ones that have permanent retention or long-term, and have high, fiscal or administrative value to us, the cost to replace them can be either impossible, or it can at least be a big burden on us. And we want to try and avoid that, or at least mitigate it as much as we can. So, if nothing else, just make sure you and your staff are keeping an eye on electronic records. You're monitoring them. You're making sure everything's okay. One of the easiest things to do to protect your electronic records is to back them up. And so that means, saving a copy of them, a second copy, in a separate place. No matter what the retention on the records is, backing up is always a good idea. Having conversations with your IT staff about which of your electronic records are backed up and how frequently they're backed up can save you a lot of headaches down the road. Similarly, when new technologies or new equipment is adopted by your office, so let's say you're all getting new computers, or you've moved from the current version of Microsoft Word to the next one, or something like that, it's important to make sure that you're migrating your electronic records to those new formats and those new hardwares as well. We run into this sometimes where an office, they get a new file format, so everybody is using the new version of Word, but they forget about records that are stored on disks or CDs or flash drives that are kept on the shelf, so they're not plugged into the network, and so they won't migrate to the next format. I know that Microsoft Word can typically read files saved in the last few versions of the format, but anything older than that can't be by themselves, and that means you're going to have to either get your IT to help you, or you're going to have to pay a vendor to convert those files, and that can get really pricey. Believe it or not, from time to time, our office will get calls from people who have floppy disks. They have those really old magnetic tape reels, like the IBM ones from back in the 70s and 80s, and they say, we have permanent records stored on this. What do? I need to get to these records. And it can cost them thousands of dollars to convert those. That's not really a service that we can provide. We don't have the equipment to do that all the time. So really just avoid those problems down the road. Make sure that all of your records are always stored in kind of the current or up-to-date file formats. Remember, if it's not accessible, you don't have the record. So that's something that we always want to avoid. And the last thing that I want to cover here in this section, or kind of in this webinar really, is the Permanent Electronic Records Policy that the Commonwealth issued in 2019. So I mentioned that we had a big update to the manual a couple of years ago, and this is one of the big ones. In the past, before this new policy was issued, if you had a record that had permanent retention, so it must be kept forever, the rule was that you had to keep at least one copy of that record in what we called eye-readable format. So it's something that you can physically hold up and read, which would be paper or microfilm only. And this was the same for state, county, and local government. In the past few years, however, new policies have been passed for all three levels of government in Pennsylvania that replace this rule with a new policy that allows you to keep permanent records exclusively in electronic or digital format. And we call it the PDFA policy for short, but it's the Permanent Electronic Records Policy. And this is all found in the Municipal Records Manual. There's a version of it that's in the County Records Manual, and there's a separate one for state that's also available on our website. It's in the Management Directive. So you can find all of this on our website, but I'm just going to talk about the municipal one for now. But in a nutshell, what this policy states is if you want to keep electronic records exclusively in electronic format, so no more paper copies, you can do that. You are allowed to do that. But there's a few extra steps you've got to follow. One is that you have to keep these records stored in what's called the PDF/A or PDFA file format. Now, PDFA, if you've never heard of it, is a special version of the PDF format that Adobe makes, which is designed especially for long-term preservation. And PDFA is like an open source free file format which is rated for long-term preservation. It's got a couple of features in it which make documents hard to modify. It protects them from long-term change and corruption and things like that. So it's right now the only file format that the Commonwealth is kind of confident with and allowing people to store permanent electronic records in. That might change in the future, but for now, they must be stored in this PDFA format. In addition to that, you also need to keep 3 copies of each record, a use copy, a security preservation copy, and a backup copy. And the backup must be stored physically separate from the other copies that you have, so you would need to have that in a cloud storage location or on a server that's stored physically somewhere else besides where the other copies are kept. The records must be stored in a live server environment, so this means you can't save those records and put them on a hard drive that's sitting on a shelf or a disk or something like that. They've got to be connected to a live server. And finally, there is a one-time notification form that needs to be sent to the State Archives or the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission that states that you're going to be keeping an electronic record It states that you'll be keeping a permanent record electronically and that you're going to follow this policy. And this is a one-time form that must be done for each type of record. So let's say, this year you've decided we're going to keep our ordinances and resolutions. We're going to keep them electronically from now on. You would send us one notification for that, and you never have to send ones, even if next year, if you're going to scan more old ordinances, you don't have to do an additional notification. And then if you are doing another type of record, let's say, HR records or, building deeds or something like that, if you were going to store them electronically, that would be a separate notification form that gets sent into our office. It's just a notification, so as soon as you send it into us, you're free to go. You don't have to wait for a response from us or an approval or anything like that, which is a little bit different from what we did in the past with microfilm notification records. So that is that. Again, the particulars of this policy are available in the records manual and on our website, and we also have a pretty useful guidance document and an FAQ page that has a lot of the kind of practical questions that come up from this policy. So you can always kind of look there, or you can call us with questions that you might have. I know this can sound a little technical intense, but like I said before, with permanent records, they have extreme value to us, fiscally, financially, legally, and we just can't risk losing them. So we have to take these extra precautions for them. We can't get them back if we lose them. So we've got to be careful. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about this just because I feel like we're kind of in the later phase of the quote pandemic. So not a lot of folks are starting to telework now, but just I want to talk a little bit about teleworking, or if we have staff who are working remotely, and how they can protect their records and make sure that they're being safe, because these are public records that are still stored at home. First, just a quick disclaimer, always follow your municipality's internal policies and procedures on teleworking. Teleworking procedures always need to comply with records laws and regulations and any specific policies and procedures that you have on your end. But that being said, there are some best practices that we can also follow with these. Records that are stored at home are still considered public records. They are subject to the right to know law, whether they're stored on an office piece of equipment that an employee takes home, or if they're stored on a personal device, whether that's a laptop, a computer, a phone, or a tablet or something like that. If it's a public record, it's still going to be subject to right to know. That's something to keep in mind. We always recommend that staff who are working at home keep government or public records separate from other records or documents in the home. If possible, we want to only keep those electronic records on government-issued computers and devices. We don't want people to keep them on their personal device if possible. Try and physically separate paper documents from personal records that might be in a home office or something like that. And also, if you have paper records, we want to try and return them to the work office or to a secure office location as soon as practicable. So we want people, if they're actively using the records while they're working from home, that's fine, but if they're no longer working with them and they're just kind of inactive or not being used, it's better to keep them back in the office as much as possible. Use work accounts for any official business matters. We don't want employees using a personal account to do agency or office business, especially also when it comes to, we've heard sometimes with people using social media or other non-work online platforms like Discord or Slack or other places like that to do online or to do business online, and we really want to avoid that. And if it is necessary to do business or to communicate in those ways, we just want to make sure that our staff are transferring those records off of those systems as quickly as we can and putting them in an official office or government storage location as soon as we can. Like I said before, all of these records that employees have at home while they're teleworking are subject to right to know requests. And we also, this isn't a requirement, but we have been recommending make public records available online if possible, especially during pandemic. If you've had requests for certain kinds of popular records that don't have any confidentiality concerns and you've got space, put a copy of them up on your website, and then people don't have to necessarily come to you and request those records officially. They can just look at the website. And of course, that's not appropriate for all types of records, but if you've got things like minutes from meetings, like public meetings, annual reports, things like that, copies of ordinances or resolutions, those can be things that's easy to put online. You can quickly share those links with people to avoid having lots and lots of requests for records that can burden your staff. Unauthorized people, including family members who are at a staff person's home, should not have access to any public records. Of course, make sure that people have good passwords on all their devices and places where records are stored. Especially if people are using, or they're using records that have personally identifiable information on them or anything else that's confidential, it's especially important. I have a couple other points up here. Staff should avoid using public Wi-Fi just because that's not as secure. Be especially wary of viruses and malware, especially if staff are using personal devices, and they might be doing something, after hours on their computer, but it's got government records on it. That's something that is something we want to avoid as much as we can. And we also want to shred our records when we're getting rid of them at the end of their retention time, or if they're, drafts and notes and things like that we no longer need to keep. We don't want to put public records in recycling or in the dumpster, because there's always one guy in every town who likes to go dumpster diving, and he finds government records, even if they could have been put in recycling. And we just don't want people rifling through those. You never know what they might find by accident. So just avoid the headaches, shred records as much as you possibly can. All right, that's a good place to wrap. I see we have a couple of questions here in the chat, so I'm going to go to those first. If there's something else, please feel free to type it in. I've got my contact up here on the screen if there's something that you'd want to talk about later on or offline, or maybe a question that's just specific to your office. I am here, my job is to do records management assistance to all levels of state government in Pennsylvania. This is what I do all day. You're probably not the first person with your question, so I'd be more than happy to help out with you with anything that might come up. I also have a link here to our website with the Pennsylvania State Archives. And like I said, we have a records management tab, so you can find copies of all the different retention manuals for all the levels of government. You can find the full PDFA policy and the other policies and records management manuals. We have a technical leaflet section which has just a lot of advice and best practices for lots of different types of records and situations, really a little bit of everything. So we have a lot of great resources there that I would definitely encourage you to check out. Somebody just asked if a copy of this PowerPoint will be available. George, I think you had one up on the website already.
Yeah. Deborah, the PowerPoints that we use for these webinars are available on our website on the training page. When you click on that, you're welcome to copy any of those down. Also, this session is being recorded, so that if you'd like a copy of the recording, because of the size, we can't post it and we can't email it, but if you send us a flash drive with a note saying what you'd like and a self-addressed stamped envelope, we'll be happy to make a copy and mail it back to you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, George. And actually, along with that, on our website, we have copies of some. They're not quite the same. They don't have those same records or right-to-know focus, but we've done other records management trainings for county and municipal government, and we've recorded them, and we have links to them on our website, so that's something you can always watch later. All right, let's see what questions we've got here. I'm just going to read these in order. The first one's here from Jackie again, who writes, in the record destruction resolution we do on a yearly basis, how critical is the size in cubic inches of the documents? In some cases, it might only be 1 to 10 pieces of paper. That's a good question. There's nothing explicit on how the volume needs to be stated in a resolution. So we get people who do lots of different things. Some people will just say how many boxes they got rid of. Other people will measure it precisely down to the cubic inch, like you mentioned. It's not required. I would just say do whatever seems useful for you. So if it's a small collection of records, you could just say 10 pages or something like that. If it's a larger collection of records, you might want to say 15 boxes or 25 cubic feet of records. No requirement, so just I would say whatever makes it clear what the volume is. So if you have to look at that later, we know what we're talking about, or we know what's been done. And this is especially important for records that are destroyed, and then 15 years later somebody needs to look at that and just see what was destroyed in the past. One of the reasons that we have this resolution that's a requirement is that if there is a request or if there's some sort of need for those records later on, we don't have people hunting around for them saying, oh, they might be somewhere. This resolution kind of confirms that the record was destroyed, so we know that it's not stored somewhere else. So if we see, oh, we destroyed just a couple of pieces of paper in 2021, that might be more useful for staff than just saying we destroyed 1 cubic inch, and they might say, well, I don't know how many that is, and maybe there's something still somewhere in the office. So I know that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but the answer is really just whatever is the most useful for you, Jackie. Thank you for asking that. Okay, another question here from Terry Lee, who asks, for electronic records, is it best to maintain 3 copies including the security preservation file and the backup copy of the security preservation file. Must these 3 files be kept on 3 separate live servers? If a record does not have permanent retention, then no, you do not have to follow any of those things. Like I said, this PDFA policy only applies when a record's retention is permanent. That's the only type of record this applies to. But when you do have permanent records, yes, you do need to maintain 3 copies, including that security preservation file and the backup. And the 3 files, the backup needs to be kept on a separate server or a separate location from the other 2, from like the use copy and the security preservation copy. And this is all spelled out in the policy itself, and I think it's covered in the guidance document. So that's kind of the answer. Is it depends, of course. If an office wants to store non-permanent records in PDFA and you want to keep multiple copies, you are more than welcome to do that. And sometimes that's a good idea when a record has like long-term preservation needs or like long-term retention, like 50 years or 100 years or something like that, but it's not explicitly permanent. It's just not a requirement as far as the policy and the law goes that's in the manual. So I hope that helped, Terry Lee. Feel free to get in touch with me if you need any more clarification.
We got an email here in the office a couple minutes ago, so I'm assuming it's someone who's online and participating in the webinar. It's from Pamela from West Bradford Township. And I think Tyler has probably already answered the question since you submitted the email, but it's just wondering if electronic records are acceptable or do we also need a paper copy. And like Tyler was saying, if it's a permanent record, you do have the option of converting it over to PDF-A or maintaining a paper copy, whichever works best for your particular situation, as long as you're using a format that is secure for a permanent type of record.
Thanks, George. And the only other thing I would add to that, it doesn't come up all the time and there's no state requirement, but I know some offices have had questions about like documents, paper documents that have inked signatures on them. And so there have been questions like, can we make an electronic copy and get rid of the paper with the actual physical signature on it? As far as Commonwealth Records Management and Records Retention Policy or law goes, yes, you can. Although that's always something to check maybe with your solicitor or with your governing body to make sure that they are comfortable with that, because that may be different in your own local situation. So that's always something to check if you have things like signatures or other types of, especially legal documents, that there may be something, some reason, some kind of business or legal reason that you would want to have the original official paper copy of that. That doesn't come up all the time, but if it does, that's just something to consider. But in general, yes, you can, anything that's paper, you can just keep it electronically, and that's fine as far as the law and the policy goes. All right. Another question here from Rose. If employees are using personal cell phones and text and computers for township-related business, is that subject to right to know? Would it be best for the township to supply each employee with an issued cell phone and laptop? George, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that always comes up. Yes, it's not how the message is sent or where the message is stored. Rather, it is the content of the message. Does it reflect a transaction or activity of the agency? And if we go back into case law with the right to know law, gosh, this goes back to, I think, 2010. The case is called Silverstein. And the courts basically said you cannot use personal devices and personal accounts to hide the public's business. So we consider it a best practice to issue accounts to your employees and officials and to issue cell phones and laptops to your employees and officials, but we realize, that may not always be possible. There's nothing illegal about using personal accounts and personal devices. It's just that it can get messy when you get right to know requests for documents or records that may be on those personal accounts and personal devices. And, you can set up a Gmail account for free that would reflect, your township or your borough. And we strongly recommend you do that. And more we're seeing the use of smartphones for conducting the public's business. So I think it is probably cost effective to issue cell phones to those staff who have what I'll call a bona fide need for it. But getting back to the main point of your question, it depends on the content of the message. If it reflects the business of the agency, it's a public record, regardless of where it might be stored.
All right, super. Thanks, George. I have nothing else to add to that one. It looks like we're right up here on 11 o'clock, so I think it's a good time to wrap up. I've got my contact up here on the screen, and please feel free to either email me or George if you have any other questions. George, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think it's been a really good session. Lots of good questions, folks. Thank you.
Yeah, these were great questions. All right, everyone. Well, I hope that we get to see from you or hear from you sometime in the future. I hope I can help you with any other records management questions or needs. And until then, have a great day and take care, everyone.